Throughout this podcast, we have consistently discussed the American war effort in Afghanistan from the counterinsurgency or COIN perspective. What is seldom discussed is the effort surrounding the original intent for America going to Afghanistan, counterterrorism. Commonly referred to as CT in the military community, our counterterrorism operations targeting Al Qaeda, the organization responsible for the attacks of 9/11, was our primary and first objective. When did we shift our focus from CT to a failed COIN mission that dragged out our presence in Afghanistan and added unnecessary deaths and billions of dollars in wasted spending? And with America all but formally gone from Afghanistan, was our CT mission a success, and what will future over-the-horizon CT operations in Afghanistan look like? Our guest today served in Afghanistan both in the conventional capacity, supporting the COIN mission, as well as in direct support of counterterrorism operations with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and he'll try to help us answer those questions over the next hour. Welcome to the Boardwalk. All right, welcome back to episode 10 of the Boardwalk. This is probably the episode that I'm most excited to do because we're going to talk some of the more current events, specifically what has happened in the last 2 months since we started this podcast, and actually 2 months to the day since the first episode came out. So, hooray, we've made it. Before we get into today's topics, I just want to remind everybody, one, thank you for those who have liked the Facebook page. I think half of Stu's friends list so far has liked it. So that works out because I hate Facebook. So I don't have any friends. So the like 85 or 90 people or whatever it is, plus like my mom, thanks. Hopefully we can get some more people on there, and I'll try to be a little more active in interacting with the people who like to comment on there. As always, we've got the Instagram page, which is at the Boardwalk Podcast. And there you'll find the link to the various podcasting sites or hosting sites, as well as the Facebook page. But today's topics, part 2, I already said we're going to talk more current events. But part 1, we're going to carry on that conversation that we had last week talking about Pakistan and their counterterrorism operations. We're going to shift that over to America's counterterrorism operations because I think something that I think almost universally everybody forgets is that we didn't go to Afghanistan to build the government. We went to Afghanistan on a counterterrorism mission to push out Al Qaeda and seek retribution for 9/11. That was the whole point of it. And so to help talk that through with us, I have a buddy of mine, Mitch Chahalis, who we went to AIT together. We were stationed together in North Carolina before he went on to bigger and better things outside of the Fort Bragg sphere. So, Mitch, thanks for joining us. You want to do a quick little intro about yourself, and then we'll start talking about the very complex world of COIN versus CT?
Absolutely. Thanks, Zach. So, as you mentioned, Mitch Chahalis, I served for 12 years. My initial assignment was at 18th Airborne Corps as an analyst, just focusing at Afghanistan and Pakistan kind of as a whole at a macro level. From there, I moved over to an infantry battalion in the 101st. I only spent 2 years there, then moved over, did 3 years at 7th Special Forces Group with a couple of deployments down south to Kandahar and Zabul. But the majority of my military career in the last 6 years before I ETS'd was spent in 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment up at Fort Lewis, where I was the senior intelligence analyst / S2 NCOIC for the organization. And that included 4 deployments, all focused on the counterterrorism mission that was centered in eastern Afghanistan.
All right. So a quick little rundown of how it all started. I think we're all familiar with 9/11, so I'm not going to insult anybody's intelligence there. But moving on after that. Well, it was the day that Augusto Pinochet had his overthrow of the Chilean government, but that's a different 9/11. That's for a different episode. Following 9/11, the first operations in Afghanistan were counterterrorism, or as we're going to call it, CT related. Very famously, you have the infill into Mazar-e-Sharif, which led to the movie 12 Strong. I don't know if it's any good. The book's pretty good. It's called Horse Soldiers. If you haven't read Horse Soldiers, I would recommend it. It's pretty nice detail of what the hell was going on and what the situation was really like at the very onset of the conflict.
It's like the 7th week in a row you've shilled that book. I mean, we're getting in Anand
It's a
Gopal
good
territory
book.
now, dude. I think we've mentioned him on every
I've mentioned it like 3 episodes. I'll stop talking about it. Fine.
The movie's
Um,
pretty great if you wanna get kind of a visual of Dostum and how they essentially the entire movie they're like desperately trying to keep Dostum alive, and he keeps doing like ridiculous things to try to keep his men motivated and like keep following him,
I need to check.
as is the case with a lot of Afghan war leaders. Like the guys have to think you're kind of a badass, or else they won't follow you.
I'm just giving you a hard time, Zach.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to derail the conversation.
That's fine. I'll live.
That's
I've
fair.
had worse. So the first couple years, really, it was for the large part CT related. It was all counterterrorism, and then slowly, I think probably with the introduction of the war in Iraq, and we had that redistribution of resources from Afghanistan into Iraq, and people were having to do more with less. I think is really where this counterinsurgency or this coin element picked up, because the Taliban took advantage of that lack of pretty much American fighting power being in Afghanistan, and they started to reach out and establish those old connections that they had, taking advantage of a very corrupt Afghan government and Afghan military, right? But really, what was important and what mattered was that counterterrorism mission mission. And that really centered in, like we said last week, the P2K area, Paktika, and Coast. I don't know why I was thinking Kapisa last week. Maybe too much
It's
beer.
a good rhyming pattern. Paktika, Paktia,
Yeah,
Kapisa. Yeah.
they're all close enough.
Yeah. And doing, Ghazni and Nangarhar and
Kunar.
really Kunar along that eastern Afghan border with Pakistan is really where we focused our operations on. And Mitch, do you want to kind of, without saying things that can't be said, kind of describe what the CT mission was like when you were out there?
Yeah, so geographically, you hit it pretty much on the head. And there was even a joke in the task force in the later years when we had to pay attention to the Taliban that nobody had ever seen what the left side or the west side of the Afghan map looked like if you worked in the task force. Now, that was also due to the nature of the information that we had and where these people were hiding out at. So if anybody had never spent any time in eastern Afghanistan, it kind of looks like western Montana, the North Cascades, southern Canada, just really drastic river valleys, which make it pretty easy for you to hide out in. So the initial mission was to track down bin Laden and any of his remnants of his AQ inner circle that was responsible for plotting the 9/11 attacks. And now what that led us to is a couple of what we called nexus connections. So this would mean that either some Taliban guys or some Haqqani guys would afford housing and safe haven to Al-Qaeda operatives and Al-Qaeda supporters all throughout eastern Afghanistan. And I think that may have instigated the coin mission creep, but we'll come back to that. And so as we expand across our surveillance in eastern Afghanistan and we find the few pockets where people are at, it's still very hard to get there because American troops can't get in there safely with the aircraft we have at the time. You really can't drive because then everybody's going to get away. And even airstrikes are pretty much out of the toolbox, if you will, based upon terrain, civilian concerns, etc. So it really made the mission set pretty difficult, and it made it have to be pretty exact when you were doing targeting out there. Eventually, the U.S. did get traction against Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda operatives, surprisingly through a lot of cooperation with Pakistani ISI. They actually did a few things for us across the border, which I'm sure you guys are already aware of and probably touched on in last week's episode, that had a mutual effect against Al-Qaeda and its support network in the East. And then as long as it took about, say we started in 2001, I'd say 2016, 2017 is where we had first seen the significant gains in a degraded Al-Qaeda organization to where we felt comfortable saying that they have minimal capability of conducting external operations, which we reference as XOps, which was always the number one priority, going after targets who either had planned attacks, had been responsible for initiating them, or were actively planning them. So removing those cells and their capabilities from Their safe havens in eastern Afghanistan. And then, as Zach also mentioned, just the retribution for 9/11. So there were still 6 to 8 people who were part of bin Laden's inner circle running around Afghanistan and Pakistan that eventually were served their own version of justice. And then in the midst of that counterterrorism operation in about 2014, 2015, ISIS established a branch in eastern Afghanistan. Now, what that looked like was the Pakistani Taliban was selected by ISIS's branch from Syria to represent ISIS in Afghanistan and Pakistan, or as they represent the Khorasan region. And they were able to overtake several district centers that bordered Pakistan very quickly in Nangarhar, and then from there establish their own ISIS brand level of government, similar to what you saw in Raqqa, in Iraq, in Syria, and that exacerbated the CT situation in eastern Afghanistan for 3 or 4 years, because then we were taking on AQIS, which was their our Indian subcontinent branch of AQ, and then also ISIS. The interesting thing is it took a long time, took multiple years. I think that branch stood up in 2014, 2015. And they are finally in a position where they can't operate either, very similar to where AQ and AQIS currently sit in the Afghan conflict. And I've talked about this recently with a couple of friends that I was in regiment serving the task force and the IC with. We all see it. We know that the Afghan war is essentially lost. The Taliban has basically won. Like, we can say that because they are. They've literally taken back all the territory that we fought for.
I don't think it's a debate at this point, really.
It's not. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. But on our side in the last 6 years, I mean, the CT stuff is like, we were really successful because things that were actively going on and things that could have actively happened did not because of the efforts. So it's an interesting dynamic, especially for me, because I split my time across the military between fighting the Taliban and fighting counterterrorism in Afghanistan, to be on like the winning side of a losing war. It's like the CT capability currently does not exist the way it did before 2011, just because of the operations and success we had. Now you're seeing the same people who provided safe haven to bin Laden after he was on the run from the Tanzania attacks, taking over the country again. And you just, as an intel analyst, you don't have to be, the director of analysis at the CIA to understand that this also presents a very nerving and drastic void of security in Southern Asia that could definitely be leveraged for continued terrorism operations, similar to what we saw before 9/11, as the Taliban continues to do this.
I think that's the big concern, though, isn't it, Mitch? Is that I mean, it's one thing. I mean, everybody. The Taliban have, I mean, I hate to say it because it almost sounds traitorous in a way, but the Taliban, I mean, they have the might makes right in the geopolitics. They have the right and the capabilities to rule the country, but a Taliban rule seems like it might be a more permissive environment for these people that you fought against your entire military career to kind of gain another foothold there, maybe flourish again after efforts you and other guys made in that fight.
Right. Yeah. And I completely agree. And the thing that's interesting is, like, not being naive, I understand that while the Taliban as a whole, their overall goal is to get back in governance because they were ruling the government when we came over to invade. There's probably a few people at the top level who are like, yeah, we really can't get back involved with AQ and anybody like that because that's how we fucked this up last time. So let's keep it all good to go so we can keep ruling. But then you already know the hardline ideology that exists behind a lot of these people's motivations and why they're in the organizations they're in, and they're not going to give a shit. They're going to be meeting with dudes from the Punjab and Pakistan talking about how we can blow up Navy bases. You know what I mean? And it's, everybody knows that that's going to happen. And
I think any potential for the Taliban to push back on an AQ presence in Afghanistan, I'm really skeptical of that because of Sirajuddin Haqqani.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So we've referenced him before. He's either the number 2 or the number 3 in the Taliban, depending on who you ask and what day of the week. Sometimes it's him, sometimes it's Mullah Yaqub, who was Omar's son. But Sirajuddin Haqqani is the leader of the Haqqani network, which is linked to Al Qaeda, as well as obviously the Taliban. He sits on the Taliban Shura. And I think when you have that relationship where one of the Al Qaeda senior military commanders sits on the Taliban Quetta Shura, I find it very hard to believe that Al Qaeda is not going to roll right back into Afghanistan and resume what
Oh
they were
yeah,
doing. Now, it may not, it probably won't happen immediately,
yeah,
right? Like, I could see somebody in the Taliban, you know, telling Siraj Haqqani, hey, yeah, you guys are more than welcome in 2022, something like that.
right.
For now, you still have the Fatah. You need to keep operating in the Fatah until everything cools down here and you can come back in. That's what
Right.
I think that's more likely than the Taliban telling Al Qaeda, no, you're not coming back.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting too because like the guy, he's like basically their liaison between the Taliban and AQ for the last, 15 or 20 years. Sirajuddin is, and he also is in charge of their Peshawar Shura, so the people who are responsible for planning and blowing up VBIDs in Kabul from the Taliban side. And so, like in my eyes, he's more of a terrorist than anybody in the Taliban is, just because of what his network's done and what their special mission is.
Absolutely.
But yeah, at some point he's probably going to come back across and be the governor of P2K.
Oh, yeah. I think they've probably got a nice position worked out for him when they get back in governance.
Well, he'll have to fight Gulbuddin's militia, but one of those two will run P2K.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, Gulbuddin's been so marginalized over the past 20 years. I mean, they really don't stand much of a chance with all the power that the Haqqani has in the P2K area. Plus, it's his familial birthright, as it were. So he'll definitely be rolling his little fiefdom down there.
So yeah, I mean that the whole counterterrorism stuff is I mean, I worked on some of that doing aviation stuff when I was in the Army, but after that, it was just pure, train, advise, assist, and that you talk about an abject failure, man. I mean, it's just all falling apart. I mean, at what point, Mitch, do you think? At what year was it where we were like, you know what? I think you kind of touched on it earlier, where we're going to stop focusing on We're going to build a government too. Like, I wonder at what point we just decided to do that. It wouldn't.
Yeah. So, man, I think off the top of my head, I want to say it was about 04-ish, something about the
around the
Bonn
first
conference.
election.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. They had the interim government because they were like, okay, yeah, the Taliban was the government. We removed them and it essentially created an insurgency. Somebody has to do this. Let's figure out what we can do. Who makes sense? And they were like, let's get the dude who's super powerful from the majority tribe to be the president. This will certainly go well. He will not be biased and unfavorable in his position.
The face of the Aruzgan uprising who didn't lift a finger during said uprising.
Yeah,
and
who got escorted by an SF team around everywhere.
Yeah, let's put him in charge. And then 10, 15 years later, Ben Kingsley can play him in a movie.
Yeah.
Flawlessly.
Does Ben Kingsley play him? I always thought they looked the same. Is he in a movie as Karzai?
Yeah, that was him.
What movie?
Yep.
War Machine.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, you're right.
I watched that today for research for this episode.
Nice.
Well, I did some actual reading too, but I felt like watching War Machine, which for the audience, I have learned in my travels that the level at which people enjoy or hate War Machine is in direct contrast to their feelings on the war in Afghanistan. If you are a staunch supporter of continued U.S. involvement, you fucking hate War Machine. And if you're, I think, a little more realistic like us and going, this is an abject failure and we need to get out before it gets worse, War Machine's a pretty good movie. Yeah. That's how I feel about it.
I guess on top of that, it's the level of surprise that you have in the movie. Like if you go into the movie and you're like, oh, well, this makes perfect sense. Like, the new guy comes in, goes and visits Ghani, and he's more concerned about goes and visits Karzai, and he's more concerned about getting his VCR working than talking about rebuilding the country, with a new plan. Then it's a little more enjoyable.
Since we are talking CT and coin, I will say, I don't know how much of the movie is factual, right? I didn't read the book, but if General McChrystal walked in to the talk in Kabul or wherever he was, and he said, I want to take Helmand province, I would applaud that because that's ambitious. And I think that's the big thing that we were missing, was that ambition. In the scene, he's talking to, I believe it's a British soldier, it's either British or Australian, uh, one of our English speaking allies, and
They have the Queen
they're
on their
talking.
money.
Yeah, they all it may have been Canada then. But he's talking to this officer about Helmand Province, and he's like, we have one base, which was Camp Bastion. And he said, and everything else is no man's land. He's like, well, why is that? He goes, well, it's just Taliban everywhere. He goes, well, they're not going to leave if you don't force them. If you don't go in there and you meet them, they're just going to keep building up their presence and their governance, right? And I mean, it was to the point. This was right before President Obama announced the 30,000 troop surge, conveniently with a timeline right afterwards. So that negates everything you're trying to do right there when you tell the enemy when you're going to leave. But even with that 30,000 troop surge, which was meant predominantly, almost exclusively for Helmand Province,
You gotta love that.
we still didn't make much inroads. We were able to. We had Shorab. We had a couple more camps, right? But we never got into northern Helmand. Musa Kayla was just locked down, stronghold Taliban. You go
Sangin
down.
was a shit show.
Yeah, none of it ever really worked, and but that was the mentality, at least of this one officer, right? One officer doesn't speak for the entire war effort, but to look at a dish or province, just go, yeah, it's a lost cause. Why even try? Well, that's a problem. Like we didn't do much with Daikundi, but that's because Daikundi is 100% Shia Hazar, and the Taliban aren't messing with them because Iran's backing those guys. So that was the real big issue with Coin. CT, on the other hand, I agree with you, Mitch. I think CT worked out pretty well and the best example is the Islamic State in the Khorasan province. Did you guys call it ISIS-K or ISK?
ISIL KP is what we call it.
Or ISKP.
So it was, it was ISIS-K, ISIL KP, and I think the last thing that we landed on that was like the last 3 or 4 years of like, this is what we call it and don't call anything else, was ISIS-K.
Well, it should have been ISKP because there's no Khorasan province in the Levant, and that drove me up the wall.
I know.
Oh.
Hey, when the ops guys get to name things, sometimes it's not always accurate.
Oh, so speaking of that, when the Taliban cut off Route Bear, which was the main road, from Kandahar to Uruzgan, we were working with the captain who was sitting on the jock floor. He got to rename the new dirt road. He went with Route Cubs, and I was really fucking upset because we could have spent like 10 minutes and came up with. It could be worse, but like we could have had some fun
route
with
charts by then.
Yeah.
I mean,
route charts. For our little fake defense contracting company with our ping pong paddles.
Ursa Minor if we're feeling fancy or something.
Have some
like it could have been fun. But what I wanted to ask you, Mitch, you talked about like the resources. So I know for us, man, there was maybe 3 or 4 military analysts in the KIFC with us. Like leadership were green suiters, but we had like 1 or 2 guys in the SIGINT shop. We had like an imagery person, and then we had a warrant officer who sat around on his nuts and just got in the way. ISR assets were really bad, and I think we'll talk about that in another episode. But
sure,
it would take
bring me back for that one.
It would take a week to get one 10-digit grid flown and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, did you guys have that resource issue like towards the end as well?
No.
I would say I would hope
when
not.
I was doing it in 2015, we were flying 12 missions a day. I
hate to sit in a room with like former analysts, because we all had the same. And I remember when I was in like 7th group, and I was like, "What do you mean this MQ1 just can't look at this one village real quick?" You know what I'm saying? And then like you go to the other side, it's like, my team had like 8 lines of ISR starting, at midnight, going for 24 continuous coverage. Like that wasn't an issue. But when you talk about resources, to circle back to what you said about the anecdote with the Canadian officer or whatever, saying it was impossible, I feel like a lot of times the military was put in that position in Afghanistan because they didn't have the proper resources to do the mission, especially in the counterinsurgency realm. It was like, go clear the Taliban out of this district. Here's an infantry platoon. And you're like, wait a second, you said district. I need like at least like a battalion minus for this. This doesn't make any sense. and people were having to figure it out like that. But yeah, to answer your question, on our side of things, no, there was not a resource shortage, but also our resource pool was never taken away from the allocation to the conventional mission because, our brother and fathers at JSOC had the ability to pull everything together for the global task force and then subdivide
Right.
from there. But that's also probably speaking to why we had success in the mission is because we had that. It was the national mission force. We had all the assets and all the IC support that you needed from the subject experts. So
It's pretty easy to keep those resources when nobody's focusing on what you're doing.
But it's
Yeah.
also easy to and I hate to be so crude about it. It's also easy to kill terrorists as opposed to build a nation. It's a lot easier to kill terrorists
Absolutely.
than to build a nation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, because, you find them, you're like, okay, no women or children are nearby. We're either going to raid or
Find,
strike.
fix, finish, man.
And that works out. But yeah, dude, you come out to a village in the middle of like Kunar province and you're like, hey, we're going to build you guys a well and a road. And then as you're like building the road to go build the well, they blow you up. And you're like, what are you doing?
Right.
Don't you want the well?
Yeah.
And they're like, no, we don't want your evil capitalism money. And you're like, this is confusing. What am I doing here?
Or
devilish polio shots.
the villagers are cool with it. The Taliban comes in, blows it up, and then you're like, well, we'll go do a project
Right.
somewhere else. And then the villagers feel betrayed. It's
Yeah.
such a
I
such
know.
a bigger,
I remember
complex
seeing a
issue.
story. I remember seeing a story when I was in Zabul. I think it was in Mayaneshan, so northern Kandahar. A civil affairs team had come through in like 2009 or something and built like a road to a district center. And the Taliban blew it up and then decided to rebuild it just to show that they could provide infrastructure and local services to remote people where the Afghan government didn't exist.
Was that 2017?
No, I think it was earlier than that, man. Like some of these things, they get a little fuzzy. Like, was that 13? Was that 17? I don't know.
Well,
but I remember, like, yeah.
So we were there 2016, 2017. I was the Kandahar analyst, and I remember like once I got read up on everything, got my accounts, that's when Maya Neshin just became blocked off by the Taliban. So I was just curious if that was around the time frame when that happened, because I remember like for like a month, Maya Neshin was the hot spot in Kandahar, and then after that month, it was impossible to go into that district. And as far as I know, it's still impossible.
It's all cyclical in Afghanistan. The hotspots don't really change. We clear
Nothing's
them
more
out.
cyclical than Kunduz.
Yeah. The yearly Taliban taking of Kunduz.
Yeah.
And then
The earth is healing.
Counteroffensive. Yeah, Kunduz has been taken again.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I guess it's going to be a lot less cyclical now.
Yeah, I mean, now you could just take and hold Kunduz.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Forever.
Yeah, that's true. You don't have to give it back up
Right.
to
Yeah,
Gyroa.
that's true. There won't be a Gyroa.
you'll be giving it to the Islamic Emirate. Well, I guess the Islamic Emirate
Yeah.
has it, so
Yeah,
good
that's
for
true.
them.
True. Oh man, that's an acronym I've not heard said in a long time. Gyroa, actually, for some reason we haven't used it on the
Oh,
podcast,
yeah.
so it's kind of
It's the government
brings up
of the Islamic
feelings.
Republic
Yeah, brings
of
up
Afghanistan.
feelings. It's like
It does. Or like, what if the term like green and white targeting,
That's
does
what
that
I
like get
did,
you in
man.
like a weird
Yeah,
place
that's what I
too?
did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
green and white.
Yeah, that was Kyle's
Green and
highly
white.
underrated podcast.
That was
as
my
well.
my 10
Yeah, it's
episode
called Green and White.
podcast that I tried starting before I got involved in civilian life. Yeah.
Yeah, understandable.
No, that's it's funny that, well, funny is not the right word, but it is interesting. I know I made that comment about it. It's easy to not lose your resources, or at least not lose them as much when nobody's paying attention to you, because coin was just the focus for the last 10, 15 years. Well, you brought up a good
Yeah.
point. Like when we were talking just back and forth, texting each other about, that video of the Taliban just receiving rifles and shit. And you're like, we spent so much time out there doing this stuff. And then the last 6 years when you were with the Rangers, like we had a lot of success. We made, Al-Qaeda pretty much inoperable in Afghanistan, in that part of the country. And you just see it, gone to waste. And it makes you wonder, what if we don't try this coin nonsense and we just just focus on CT? Like this could have gone completely the other way if we just focus on that CT effort, worked on disrupting terrorist networks, and then let the country figure it out themselves, whether it's a bunch of warlords, which is what they fucking had before we showed up anyways, or it's some sort of peace deal, Maybe the Taliban get tired of getting fucking attacked by us and the Northern Alliance, and they finally come to the table and there's a power sharing agreement. I think that's possible. That could have happened had we focused more on CT and not tried to tell the Afghans that you shouldn't be farming opium and you need to have a Congress.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. And it's funny when you think of the operational history of counterterrorism, it has never been synonymous with counterinsurgency or nation building until the GWOT. That's why there's counterterrorism organizations and then there's like counterinsurgency organizations such as special forces groups, etc. We had never decided to mix the two historically, and I'm sure that there was obviously the operational nuance need for that based on the dynamics in Afghanistan and Iraq. But yeah, if it was Bosnia, we didn't try to rebuild or anything. We just went in and got the war criminals, did our thing, pulled them out, extradited or not, whatever justice was served. That same model would have worked. Or as we were talking before the podcast started, if the Taliban was a recognized government by two nations and everybody else in the world was like, okay, yeah, you run the country, but I'm not going to trade with you. I don't appreciate your GDP or whatever. Once we realized that they're harboring him and bin Laden's still there, dude, the CIA gives the Taliban $500 million for a terrorist. You know what I'm saying? That's not that far-fetched. The Taliban would be stoked. They could make $500 million stretch longer than this war has gone on. We don't have to worry about having to fight them at all.
Cheaper.
And we get the ability to go send in, SEAL Team 6 or Delta, whoever's going to do the damn thing, and then that's it,
So,
but we don't have that capability to turn it back.
So $500 million, I guess, plus fuel costs to fly a big iron bird over there to drop off the group guys or whoever does it. I think would be less than the $2 trillion that we've spent so far.
Oh, a little bit. A little bit less.
My degree's not in math, but I think 500 million is less than 2 trillion.
I think you always, though, you're entering this kind of weird geopolitical realm that I really just don't know much about, of like national autonomy when we do that, though. So it's like, it's different. I mean, well, we overthrew a government. Oh, should we have done that? I know, but it's like, it's going to be tough to operate in a Taliban controlled, because they will control it, a Taliban controlled Afghanistan, and be like, hey guys, we noticed you guys have been harboring Al Qaeda, so we'd rather not overthrow you guys, but we'd like to do some airstrikes. Is that okay if like Americans just come in and do those things that killed your dads and uncles and turned you into terrorists? Can we just keep doing that? Is that okay? Or is that not a go?
Yeah. And you could try to maybe make it analogous to the Pakistan thing, but like the thing is we also give Pakistan an ass ton of money when we do that to get them to not care. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they're our ally. I can't imagine the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan being our ally in the future after the last 20 years.
Oh yeah, that's why they told us zero cause. Everybody is out.
Right,
you know what I mean?
Well, except for like 650 people who are at the embassy and the airport.
And
I gotta say, the people that are the soldiers that are having to like guard the airport in Kabul, fuck that.
Yeah. Do you think they're just doing
Absolutely
run-ups?
not.
Do you think they're just doing helicopter run-ups and plane run-ups like every hour on the hour to make sure they're ready to go and they get out of there?
I hope so.
Yeah, dude. Were you guys in Kabul at all when you were deployed? Did you guys?
The only time I did take a piss on Hamid Karzai International Runway, man, because we had to divert our plane there one time. It was like 3 a.m, and it was me and like 3 other dudes. We had to fuel our plane back up, and I was like, man, I gotta pee. There was one guard asleep in the whole airport. I had to go find a telephone to phone battalion to let them know we were using the credit card. We had a credit card in the plane. We had to use it for gas to buy it. And I had to go find a phone, and it was just me in there with like a pistol on, like underneath my flight jacket, just looking around, and there's just one dude asleep with his AK across the room. I'm like, I could take over the entire airport right now and cause an international.
Be a warlord.
That was it. That was the security.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the security in pretty much all these places around Kabul is not good. No. It's always like not paying attention, picking their nose into yes dudes, like, pointing at each other or something. And
one's like, probably high.
Yeah, probably.
Oh yeah, definitely. He's still got some opium in his pocket.
Is this the guy guarding the whole airport? But yeah, I went back outside, had to pee, just stood there. It was very open, very freeing to just stand there on the runway and just pee and hop back on the plane. That was my one time at Kabul. A little bit of diversion.
My second deployment, I was at Camp Duskin over by the King's and Queen's Palace. Very, very picturesque views over there. But Yeah, yeah, I was there during the totally legitimate 2014 election cycle, so
Oh yeah.
that was an interesting time to be around there. We drive around the streets. We hit some dude once. He was walking too close to the
Yep.
road, and
Yep.
there's just no sense of like self preservation. Guys just walking towards these fucking big ass armored vehicles that are rambling towards him, and he gets clipped by the mirror. And I was in the car behind him, so we got to see him kind of fly off and then act like it was their fault. Insurance scams ain't gonna work on Americans, dude.
I love our
We
cobbles.
invented
Yeah, no
those.
shit.
They're so nice. They're so great.
Yeah.
They're the best. I love the traffic jams, dude. Like their
Oh,
traffic circles are just like the fucking Thunderdome. It's awesome.
We saw them from the air all the time, and I can't believe people drive in this. Man.
Yeah.
Insane.
They actually managed to have their shit together for the 2014 elections. Like there were no major attacks. But they also had checkpoints like every 100 feet, so that probably helped.
Yeah.
They probably
Yeah.
still had more
Oh,
votes than voters.
Yeah,
Well, yeah,
probably. That's what happens when you stuff ballot boxes.
A little ballot stuffing
Yeah.
goes a long way.
yeah. I mean that's the usefulness of the country being so like decentralized. Is like, you know, you got this random ass village out here, you know, 300 people, but you know, 500 votes. It's like
25% of the CIA's budget is just for ballot stuffing and banana republics in Afghanistan.
True. Probably the case.
So in the 2 months since we released our first episode on May 6th, it's July 6th for people if they're curious, the Taliban's control, according to the Long War Journal, which is probably the best open source source for the war in Afghanistan that's out there.
Next to us, of
it's
course.
next to us, naturally. They won't
I
swear.
second that motion.
They won't give you all the deets without, you know, censoring some stuff. No, the Long War Journal, great website, a lot of good writings ran by the guys that do the Freedom or Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. But they have tracked the Taliban control in Afghanistan going back to, I think, 2012, 2011, close to a decade, if not a decade. On May 6th, they assessed that the Taliban controlled 73 out of 406, 407 districts. Today, 2 months later, they're assessing that the Taliban controls 195. So that's almost triple of where they were just 2 months ago. And that tells us a few things, and we're going to talk about these in more detail. The first thing it tells us, and I think I wrote this on one of the Facebook posts, is that the Taliban is more effective than people give them credit for. I think a lot of people will dismiss them because, you know, they're Afghans, they're cavemen, they can't do jumping jacks. Like, no, that's the Afghan army because they're all on opium, right? The Taliban's is a legitimate, at least legitimate in Afghanistan fighting force. The second thing it tells us is that the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces are not. And then the third thing it tells us is just how, I'm not going to say ineffective coin. Well, it was ineffective. But obviously, on top of not running or not conducting a counterinsurgency very well, turns out we conducted one very poorly. So I think those are the big three highlights. What we've seen over the last couple months is stories about Afghan military, or specifically Afghan National Army personnel in the north, fleeing into Tajikistan. And the first report was a dozen of them. The next report was 140. And then the third news article said over 1,000 Afghan National Army soldiers fled to Tajikistan across the border. The Taliban have opened and are directing traffic in and out of Afghanistan. And they're probably collecting taxes because that's what they do. Well, they call it taxes. It's a bribe.
Extortion money.
You know, it's to the point where Tajikistan is calling up it's either their reserve or their National Guard, but like their equivalent of a reserve or National Guard, they're being activated to like start establishing refugee camps and facilities for these Afghan National Army soldiers that are coming into Tajikistan, because Badakhshan, which is the most northern province in Afghanistan, that was for years government controlled easily government controlled. It was almost completely ran by the Taliban now. The Taliban gained back all the territory that they lost in 2001 and then some. And that's kind of where we sit today.
Yeah. Well, I think you pretty much explained everything there. Um, but it's certainly interesting that other nations, you see Tajikistan getting ready for this influx of refugees. I don't know. Historically, if the ANA had surrendered to the Taliban and just, without a fight, the Taliban usually didn't do much to them. Just like take their weapons and send them home. Which hopefully that's what happens, because you're going to see a lot more surrendering going on lately. So I hope that's the case. I hope there's. I mean, if they're going to give it up the country, you might as well, might as well be bloodless. Just let them turn their weapons in.
I'm sure a lot of it is just they understand how momentum works, and they're just like, yeah, this isn't worth it.
Right.
Yeah. Like, also, they're just like not even close to being in a position to win. Like to talk the strategy of what the Taliban's doing now, it's similar to the two other times that they've resurged throughout the Afghan war. The first time was like 07, 08. The next time was like 14, 15 time frame. And they start in Helmand and Kandahar, just like they always do. They go to the most remote district centers and remote military bases, and literally like old school siege tactics, surround the base. No logistics, no people, no anything in. Eventually, the Afghans, who were already underfed, undersupplied, under-equipped, suddenly are like 3 or 4 or 5 days into something and just surrender in order to like not starve to death because the writing's on the wall, not get overrun because there's like 15 dudes at a checkpoint surrounded by 100 Talibs. And then they take this same methodology and then they apply it to the district. Then they get the district, and the next thing you know, Lashkar Gah is completely surrounded by districts controlled by the Taliban, and they're just waiting for the right time, moment, or order in order to take over a provincial capital, or wait in order to do the same siege tactic and force a bargaining agreement that's more favorable in their future.
But this time they don't have to worry about U.S. air power stopping them. So it's kind of a limitless
it's a
push,
lot different now.
Just a limitless push to the first provincial capital. When did we say the first provincial capital would fall? Maybe by September?
Yeah, and I mean, with us, being essentially out of the country at this point, you can probably speed that up pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's just interesting that at this point in the war, the Afghans who are in the military should understand what's going on. And I know there's a lot of really fucked up things with the Afghan army, like their pay system, how they're supplied, the mission they are supposed to do, all that other shit. But like 20 years into it, they know what they're signing up for. They know what they're getting into. They know that at some point they should expect confrontation and a fight, but they don't even have the will to stand up for just a little bit of something. Is a common theme, and it's not the first time it's been seen. Like, I remember in 2010, our regular army infantry platoons had like 2 or 3 Afghans attached to them, and the reports back to the battalion headquarters about how they were in the field were never favorable.
So that reminds me, when we were all talking. So I was talking to Mitch separately from Stu and Kyle, and Stu said I sent him as an article that Hamid Karzai he's not putting all the blame on America, right? But he's blaming America for a lot of the problems, and not necessarily undeserving. At least that
Sure.
I do think we shoulder some of the blame, right? But just a bit. But he's very critical about just like the effectiveness of the Afghan military. And Stu, you said something to me like it's been 20. They've had 20 years to develop a warrior class, and I shifted that over to Mitch. And you brought up a great point, Mitch. They have a warrior class. They're called the Taliban.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I told Zach this, and I told I've had this conversation with a lot of my friends who are obviously on the higher intellectual spectrum. But I joined the Army. I have a group in Kentucky, right? I joined the Army when I was 17 and, did all that shit. if I was unfortunate enough to be born in Afghanistan, and when I was 17, and it was if I was going to do something similar, would I have joined the Taliban or would I have joined the Afghan army? And it's like, well, looking at how the Afghan army is like not really supported, not really winning or anything, there's a reasonable chance that I joined the fucking Taliban if I was born in Paktika or some shit.
Oh
You know
yeah,
what I
sure.
mean? Like, it's not that different of a path to get to the army like we all did. Like, these people joined the Taliban. So that's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't even really think about or even try to understand, probably because there's just a lot to unpack there.
I could spend my nights retreating from a shitty HESCO barriered like police checkpoint in Gorak district, or I can be like the fucking supply clerk in Sangin for the Taliban. I
Yeah,
know
dude.
which one I'm gonna do.
I mean, even
Yeah,
just
I'll get
Roger
those.
Pat.
I'll get everybody those white shoes.
I mean, a lot of those.
One of
Yeah,
those is more funded.
Yeah, a lot of those fighters have.
And you know,
Sorry.
Americans, you know, who haven't been following the war might be under the impression that the Taliban are like, you know, hiding in caves and coming out for, you know, quick attacks or something. But I mean, no, like for the majority of the war, they've been able to basically, you know, live out their lives, you know, in or near the village that they grew up in. You know, they know everybody. They're, you know, everyone knows them, and you know, they're essentially fighting this like essentially a civil war this entire time against the, you know, Ansif and Jaroa forces that are coming in. But yeah, I mean there's a lot of different like you're saying, there's a lot of different positions within the Taliban, and you know, it's not all just going out there and getting your hands dirty. It's a wide swath.
And I always tell
Yeah,
people,
we're not
Yeah,
all.
well, like you said, Stu, about man, what was your point? Shit, the alcohol's starting to work. It made sense. I had something, but now I lost it. Go ahead, Kyle.
oh no, I was gonna say like, uh,
We'll come
one
back.
thing I always tell people when it comes to like the war and like especially how I felt after the war and like years of just like, you know, you start to readjust to civilian life and you still have these thoughts and stuff about it is one thing I always tell people is like you end up putting yourself in the shoes of the people that you were fighting. So I remember
Yeah.
we were after like this, I mean, legendary guy, like for like shooting IDF rock, you know, orchestrating IDF attacks on Bagram, right? And that's what we did in our planes. We would spend all of our residual base defense dwell time with our remaining fuel load looking for these guys. And we kind of took that as a unit up on ourselves, right? We'd be after them, right? Like, these are the guys we're going to get, man. They've been launching rockets at us every freaking night, and we're going to find who's going to be doing this, right? So we'd use our capabilities and stuff. We finally tracked them down. We caught them, and I guess they got taken to prison or they got rolled up or something. But then it comes out, and they sent us like pictures of the guys, and they're like 17-year-old kids, man. And like, then you're just like, okay, here's a 17-year-old, and here's a picture of him and his dad standing there like in a field, just in their house, and they got like some AK-47s, and you're like, man, I've got the same pictures, man. Like I've got
Yeah.
the same pictures of like me and my dad like holding rifles or like going to shoot, and it's just like you're like, man, if I had been born in this situation, if I had been born in Afghanistan, if I had been born with like no economic opportunity whatsoever, there is no, I don't hold it against him for doing what he has to do. Right, that's his job,
Right.
and that's that whole mental thing that always plays in your head all the time. I think that a lot of war veterans face, and a lot of people like us have to deal with.
Yeah, they're not too dissimilar from us, is the thing. Yeah. Oh, and it came back to me. So, Stu, when you were talking about how, you know, they have family in the village and all that, you know, the situation that the Taliban has, that's also that's definitely why a lot of our coin efforts failed, is because the coin operation was predicated on trying to separate the insurgency from its population that was supporting it, which happened to be the people in the village they grew up with, the people that are part of their tribe, the people that they have a cultural ethos with because they share this tribal relationship, that they are already mandated to take care of each other and then generally care for each other. So I remember this specifically when I was in 7th group, is we did VSO operations, so village stability operations. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those. Yeah, so you go build up a local police force, go run the area, talking to families, trying to figure out what the Taliban is. Well, one, they're not going to tell you because that's their family member who's in the Taliban, and they're not going to give them up. And then two, if you are somehow, you know, in our business or previous business, lucky enough to find where the Taliban is at, and then you can target and remove them from the area. Well, now you just alienated and pissed off, half of a village that was critically important to your district's stability as a whole. And every time you essentially conducted a successful operation against the enemy, you further and further alienated that population. And that's because they are just so married together in a coin environment. And there's nothing you can do to fix that after, that round has essentially left the chamber.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think again going back to the movie War Machine on Netflix, in case anyone hasn't seen it. They
Give us money, Netflix.
Shameless plug.
The guy playing McChrystal broke it down pretty well. He was saying, essentially, okay, so let's do some insurgent math real quick. Okay, so you have eight Taliban in an area. You have 10 Taliban in an area, and you kill 8. How many Taliban do you have? Well, you'd think 2, but in reality, you actually have 23 because
16,
all those guys,
yeah.
all those guys that you killed, have cousins and families and nephews that are now pissed off at you and going to go join the Taliban. It's kind of, it makes a lot of sense, and it makes me question if any kind of counterinsurgency is possible without like overwhelming force. Like what would it take for that to work? You'd essentially have to completely break down to the population and have several million US servicemen over there basically overseeing things for probably about 10 plus years to try to basically switch out a culture and basically bring in something else. And that's something that America would never be able to really stomach, because long wars in general are tough to maintain, but just in general, the idea of sending essentially all of our army and marine forces over to a country to pacify it over a long period just wouldn't work.
Well, yeah, the other thing too is you wouldn't be able to man it because you'd have to have so many like civil affairs types of folks that the military is always understaffed on in order to actually have a real effect.
Yeah.
I think one of the big things, probably maybe the biggest thing you would need for a successful counterinsurgency, is you need a unifying body from that nation, and it just doesn't exist. You don't have an ideologue or somebody that the masses can rally around.
You don't have an Emperor Hirohito who can surrender to them or to the invaders.
Exactly.
Well, they also made sure to kill Ahmad Shah Massoud on 9/10 for a reason.
Yeah.
Yep. 9/11 doesn't happen if he's still alive.
We talked about that in one of our episodes too, I believe.
Yeah. Oh yeah. How the CIA decided not to fund him. Instead, they funded all the radicals and the Islamic extremists during the 80s.
You mean the Mujahideen, our friends?
Yes, our friends, the Mujahideen.
Yeah, I've seen Rambo 3, the brave soldiers.
Yeah, the brave and loyal Mujahideen. Kill a couple commies, America gets super fucking stoked.
Yeah.
Especially in the 80s, man. Cold War.
Yeah.
Okay? Miracle on Ice and all that shit. One of the things we talked about after seeing some of these articles, especially that video of the Afghan National Army just rolling up in Humvees and handing over their vehicles and their weapons. And Kyle, you said it hurts, and I didn't eat the rest of that day. I didn't think we've talked about this for a couple months now. We've talked about it independent of this podcast for 5. We've known each other 5 years. Mitch and I have known each other for going on 13 years, right? We talk about this shit. We know this was inevitable, and it still hurts so fucking much to just go. We put forth so much effort. Like, we went into a war that we knew was unwinnable, and we tried to win it. Like, there's a misconception because 3 of us. Well, you're a contractor, so that contractors, they just want to go and get paid. Well, the money was good, but you know what? We also tried really fucking hard to win this war that was unwinnable. So to see that the Afghan National Army, after a decade of being advised and trained, well, actually closer to 15 years of being trained, is just, they're not even trying to fight, it's really, really a low blow. And now, maybe there's a hope with these militias that are now picking up again. That's the new thing. The ANA is not going to fight, so now you got local militias who are starting to form again to counter the Taliban. So I think we're just, General Miller said, "Oh, well, there'll probably be a civil war." Well, the Civil War never stopped. The Northern Alliance just became the Afghan National Army.
Right.
It's all the same to them. You're just going to see a continuation of the Civil War without a bunch of English speakers in the middle of it.
Right. I think it's just too. It's not just that it hurt. I mean, yeah, it hurts. I mean, it sucks when like you said, we've been talking about it, but it's like knowing a relative is going to die versus watching them die is one thing, and also it's this kind of this promise of America, I suppose, and just watching it. Like, I mean, how many Humvees are the ANA is turning in? I mean, could you buy like a poor kid a college tuition with that? Could you pay for clean drinking water? It's this waste. It's endless waste. It's just, and you hate seeing it, man. And it just seems to be the story of this whole war. It's like, what else could you have done with that money?
Yeah, and like the human cost too. Like, shoot, I remember my first deployment, I had to do a lot of tower guard, being the enterprising PFC that I was, and you sit up there with the Afghans and you kind of get to know some of them. Like there's some good guys in the ANA. Like, I know we kind of look at it from a military point of view. Like, it sucks that a lot of them aren't fighting, but I knew this guy that was like trying to better himself. He was learning English and he wanted to like put his kids through school and shit like that. It's like it's all just going away, and we're just watching all of these different factors compound on each other to the point where the shitty ones are gonna surrender really quickly. Any of the good ones that are trying to do their duty are just gonna die, like, flat out, and we'll see
Right.
the country devolve. I mean, shoot, we had a talk in the KIFC with some of the Terps while we were there, and they were talking about how grateful they were that the U.S. came in and had stuck around, and how they were glad that we hadn't fractured the country into, like, essentially the Northern Alliance breaking off from Afghanistan, and how a unified Afghanistan was important to them. And now who knows what's going to happen now.
Yeah, I think one of the most common reasons why people, maybe support's not the right word, but why people don't want us to leave Afghanistan is that they don't want those who died to have died in vain. And I think that is an extremely understandable human reaction. Like, I get that. But the fact of the matter is that's not the reality. The reality is thousands of Americans and possibly millions of Afghans are dead, and nothing was accomplished outside of the CT mission. And maybe this is what I was trying to get across when we did our first couple episodes. We were trying to explain why we're doing this podcast. Like, in 2 months, we've got 400 and something downloads. It's not like we're reaching the fucking world, but people are hearing these stories and they're getting a little better understanding of what happened. And, people lost sons and husbands and fathers and daughters and, nieces, and they're never coming back. And those same people watch the news today and they see that Afghanistan is probably worse now than it was on September 10th, 2001. Right? That you can't help but just be angry. I used to make a joke every year, because like we all have that contingency of friends that on September 11th they post like the really boomer "I'm still angry" things on Facebook. Like, that's dumb. Like, yeah, it was a shitty thing. Let's make the world a better place for it. And I kind of get it now. Now I see it a little differently. I still think the posts are kind of stupid, right? But I see where they're coming from, because watching this and hearing about the last exfil out of Bagram in the middle of the fucking night, which apparently the Onion called 10 years ago.
That's
Yeah,
wild,
I know,
man.
right?
Literally
10 years ago,
article 10 years later.
July 18th, 2011. So 10 years to the month, the Onion, the world's most popular satire website, predicted that the U.S. would just leave Bagram Airfield in the middle of the night. And that's exactly what they did.
I feel like it feels a lot more like Vietnam than I thought it was going to when it happened.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the guys I flew with said it'd be
It
just
does.
like Saigon at the end. Like you'll just be trying to get the hell out of
Yeah.
there as fast as possible.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for some dude holding on to like the railing of a like the last Huey in the world coming out of the Kabul embassy, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, Afghanistan needs a song. Vietnam has Fortunate Son. We need to figure
Yeah,
out what
that's true.
Afghanistan's
Yeah, but
song
nothing's
is gonna
ever
be.
going to be the
Yeah.
banger Fortunate Son is, though. You'll never write a
That's
song as good
true.
as Fortunate Son.
That's a really high bar.
Yeah, for sure. But I agree with you, Zach. I mean, what do you tell these people? I mean, it sucks. I mean, it's pretty much an unwinnable thing. I mean, it's like, I mean, like, but Matt, like Mitch said at the beginning, man, like we've killed a whole lot of very, very, very bad Al Qaeda operatives. Like we have, and if we couldn't rebuild Afghanistan, if we couldn't make it this shining point of Western democracy in South Asia, then I mean, at least we killed a lot of bad people. We really did, and I don't know if that's any consolation, and maybe it doesn't mean a whole lot, but I mean, it's something. I mean, these kids. I mean, these people are they're objectively bad. I mean, they strap suicide bombs to kids. It's not
Yeah.
like you know your local farmer who decides to pick up an AK. I mean, it's bad, you know, and I don't know, and the world's better off without
Yeah,
some of
it's
them.
what some people would call evil, you know, and to kind of bring it, you know, full circle. We talk about the reason we went to Afghanistan was counterterrorism. We just so happened to get caught up in a counterinsurgency war, which became the mainstream presentation of what is going on in the war in Afghanistan because that was what the majority of people were fighting in the Taliban and the insurgency. And then eventually we, you know, air quotes, won the CT fight, or at least prevented the ability for those XOPs to occur, which is a win in the CT world. But then all the focus and attention was going on with the Taliban side. So it's like we won the reason we went there, but it doesn't feel like that. And even for me, as somebody who was an active participant in the, you know, the successes, it still doesn't feel like that. It's hard to appreciate both sides of that outcome.
So Admiral James Stavridis, he was the commander of Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, NATO commander, is basically what he was. He did an interview with PBS Boston the other day, and this is a quote when they asked him his thoughts on the overall failures or successes. He said, "For 20 years, there's been no attack on the United States that came out of a previously ungoverned Afghanistan. I did my mission," he says. "I hope that going forward we can still say that, and if we can still say that, and if we're going to pull the troops out, that we have an over the horizon capability to counter it." He is not wrong. Uh, the CT mission, I would say, was a success. We can look at it and we can say that Al Qaeda, their ability to reach out and touch the U.S. is degraded. Their ability to reach out and touch other places, that's a different topic. But we weren't there to protect, Senegal from Al Shabaab. Well, Senegal's on the other side of Africa. We weren't there to protect Kenya from Al
There you
Shabaab.
go.
We were there to protect America from. I used to be an AFRICOM analyst. I should know these things.
I know, right?
Like, yeah, that's what we were there for. And so, yeah, Admiral Stavridis is absolutely right. And I think we can safely say, I know we say everything in Afghanistan was an abject failure. The CT mission, ISK or ISIS-K or ISIL-K or whatever they are this week, they're a remnant of what they were before. I'm sure they, whatever capability they have is like you said, Mitch, it's minimal. I'm sure it's a lot of resources for very little payoff these days for them. So that is the good thing that came out of Afghanistan. The bigger overarching issue, when you factor in what Admiral Stavridis is saying and what Al Qaeda is saying and all these other groups, we're still in all the other countries, which is why they attacked us in the first place. So something in regards to our foreign policy and our military policy has to change to really reduce or mitigate that external threat in the long term.
I think that's beyond the scope of this podcast to figure that one out.
Oh, probably.
Yeah.
Probably is. I don't think we're gonna. I mean, I could solve it, but nobody's gonna listen.
Yeah, I could talk about how it could be solved, but yeah, they'll be like, that sounds like it would work too well.
Right.
Stop having bases in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
And let's stop giving them money too
Yeah.
while we're
and
at it.
Israel.
It's just brutal. I mean, because everybody has to decide, especially as it all winds down, and you can, I guess, declare it over, maybe finally. I don't know. You're gonna have to make peace with it, because that's it. Like, I mean, all these people that got out in the last 20 years. I mean, they'd retire, they'd get out of the military. It's like the war's still going on. So like now people are gonna have to start trying to piece together what it all meant. I think, in a
Yeah.
broad picture, that's gonna be tough.
So I think the logical next step, and we'll probably get into more detail about this in further episodes, is what does the Taliban government look like in 2021?
Oh
But
man.
before we answer that, which I don't know if we're gonna really answer it today, we're getting close to our time limit, well, self-imposed time limit. We had a question on the Facebook page that I answered, but I answered it on the Facebook page, but I wanted to get into maybe a little more nuance. And it's Barbara asked, has the Taliban ever held control over a region without imposing religious restrictions? And I understand that they were in control after the Soviets withdrew, but they were a reign of terror for the Afghan people. Overall, no. The shortest answer would be that no, they didn't have any sort of flexibility in that. But that's from the Mullah Omar top down approach. I'm like we were saying during the break. I'm sure you had one off guys. Maybe they didn't run a district, but maybe they were in charge of a city or a little village, and maybe they turn a blind eye in exchange for some Pakistani rupees or a cut of opium profits or what have you. I'm sure that did happen. But the Taliban they were notoriously strict, and to the point that when you read about just how strict they were, you can't believe that people could live that way. And that's mostly because of our Western upbringings, right? It's perfectly commonplace in some parts of the world, but it wasn't actually the Taliban that started that shit. The governing body or the ministry, what was it called? The Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice was not created by the Taliban. It was created by the Afghan government and funded by the Saudis, who had their own Ministry of Propagation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, more commonly known as the religious police. They're the ones in Saudi Arabia that like run around and they make sure that articles of clothing are at the proper length and that men have beards and stuff. And that's one of the more common stories you hear about the early Taliban governance was running around and they were measuring beard lengths. And I guess they give you like a certain period of time to grow a beard or something, I guess, just to make sure you're not shaving. But they banned kite flying, which led to that book, The Kite Runner. It's a very good book if you get some time to read it. I will say I don't see that, and we talked about this between shows. I don't see that, or I wouldn't be surprised if they were a little more lenient version 2. I could see them going, you know what? I don't see an issue with kite flying. They may still try to ban music and TV and shit, right? Especially in some of the more conservative places like the Afghan South. I don't think they're going to have really any problem pretty much just going back to what they wore in the 90s in the South. But I could see them in other places making those concessions in the interest of trying to rule and not fall out of favor with countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, exactly. They grew up with it, but I could definitely see like where the more, in Afghanistan is very tribal and then also somewhat broken up geographically within that. I could see some of the more moderate areas being like, yeah, America brought us Wi-Fi and internet, and if you're really into dubstep, you can play it on Saturday. You know what I mean? Or whatever that is. Whatever the equivalent of that
Not
is.
even the Taliban are into dubstep in 2021, dude.
I feel offended by that.
If you want to watch your Bollywood films,
yeah, you can do that on Saturday. That's fine.
They might. I mean, they might even have like some kind of red light district where you can watch your racy Bollywood films without dancing.
Some ankle gets shown.
I think we can all agree that women's rights are definitely gonna take a few steps backwards in Afghanistan.
Yeah, unfortunately.
They
considering how far
not,
they came.
Yeah, they have not let up on those. I don't think we're any closer to the to that picture from the 70s of westernized Afghan women walking freely through Kabul.
As a friend of ours says, I'd rather be a Saudi woman 10 years ago than an Afghan woman today.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Boardwalk Podcast. We're really excited to be growing. I want to thank everyone who found our Facebook page and is coming to maybe listen to us for the first time. We really appreciate having you guys, and if you like it and you know some friends who would be interested in these topics as well, please feel free to share the Facebook page, share the Instagram. We'd love to welcome more people in so we can get a broader audience for these important topics that we're covering. Coming up next week, we're going to look to branch out into the ISR realm and talk about the drone program, potentially with another special guest. If any of you have any questions about things we've covered in this podcast or in previous podcasts, please feel free to leave a message for us on our Facebook or Instagram. Like we did this week, this was our first big audience interaction, and we'd love to share your questions on the air, and definitely any topics that you're interested in. I'm sure we'd like to get into as well.
And thank you, Mitch, for hopping on this week with us. I'm sure we'll, if we can keep this thing going, I'm sure we can find an excuse to bring you back on so that we can talk about some more nonsense in Afghanistan.
Yeah, no worries. I will definitely make it a point to come back anytime I'm invited.
Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.